Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And excuse the slightly dark lighting, I'm sort of filming this at night. Normally I manage to get everything filmed in the day, but there's something that I have been thinking about a lot recently based on some of the books I've been reading. And that's really about memory and memoir and how we tell our own stories and the stories of specific moments. And a lot of this has been sort of tripped in my brain because of a few things I've read. So I recently spoke about reading the recent Britney Spears memoir, and also the memoir by Paris Hilton, two famous women whose lives in the early 2000s especially were really dominated by just sort of being constantly under the media gaze, and how so much of the ways they tell their stories now is a way of writing back against something and a story that was told for them. And all of this kind of came into sharp relief when I was reading this book here, Wish I Was Here, an anti-memoir by M. John Harrison, who is sort of an experimental and sci-fi writer. And so many thoughts have been kind of going through my head on this, so hopefully this will all make sense, sort of tried to put into one place here. But essentially this book, I mean, he talks about it being an anti-memoir, and his very idea right from the beginning is that it's almost impossible to really grasp memory from specific times, because we as humans are constantly looking at memory from a certain time through the lens of what's currently happening. So we might look at something that we did as a child and think, that definitely leads to this, from this thing to this thing. But actually as a child, we maybe didn't have the language or the concepts of those things, and they maybe happened almost sporadically or randomly. And in this book as well, he creates instead of notebooks, he has nout books, as in books where you sort of record things and often they mean absolutely nothing. And he challenges this very idea throughout this book that memory and memoirs should follow a distinct narrative. He talks about how most of the narrative that we tell stories through, and particularly in recent times through a sort of slightly more Hollywood edge, leads to us really thinking of stories having this narrative arc. And actually our lives don't often work like that. Often you have somebody for whom their life is fairly mundane for 30-40 years, and then something spectacular or out of the ordinary happens, and it recontextualizes everything else, where they see everything else coming before it as having led to that moment. And he really resists this urge throughout the memoir, and separates it into sections, but it doesn't follow that same narrative flow that a book that a memoir might typically have, where there's the sort of the before times, there's the time of now, there's looking to the future, there are the unexpected things, there's the big dramatic moment where everything turned around. And actually often lives don't really work like that. We work in sort of this slow build, this sort of very things might rapidly change overnight for us across our whole life, but we might also have 20 years where things are fairly stable, and where all of the changes in our lives are minor and they happen in these sorts of tiny increments or not at all. And so I found this really interesting just as a thought, and it made me think about other books where memory and memoir are really complicated, because it's almost, not to create a scale of this, but, Wish I Was Here is sort of almost the opposite end of a Britney Spears memoir, which has, is sort of telling these true facts that are things observed and kind of captured in the media. And so there are almost timestamps of various things happening of, well, you all know about this thing that happened on March the 31st in this year and blah, blah, blah. And for Wish I Was Here, we've got the, frankly incredible, this is a very good book, I think, the kind of retellings of a history where he acknowledges from the beginning that he's probably going to get most details wrong, or he's going to misremember certain details. Whenever conversations happen in memoirs, he sort of says about the kind of ridiculousness of that, because who remembers an entire conversation start to finish and how it happened? We kind of remember the gist of it. We kind of remember aspects of it in the general feel, but we don't really remember the entire thing. And he also talks about how memory is flawed in that we want to fill in the gaps with specific things that may or may not have actually happened, which also made me think a little bit of Julian by Fleur Pierets. And I was at a talk of hers recently, and she mentions how when she and her wife first met, her wife was, and when they talk basically about them having met, her wife would say things like, "Oh yes, and you were in that fur coat," and Fleur would say, "Well, I've never owned a fur coat, so that never could have happened." But that feels correct to the situation. It almost feels like it fits in that memory. So all of this got me really thinking about other memoirs or books about memory that really complicate that. So Fleur Pierets with Julian is a really interesting example, because again, there are these sort of fundamental historical practical things that did happen and that were recorded. There are all these other moments in between that weren't, and sort of exist in a sort of specific tide of memory almost. It also got me thinking about another, you can tell it's quite late at night, it's yawning already, All Down Darkness Wide by Seán Hewitt. And yes, this is just another excuse for me to talk about this book because I adore it. But in All Down Darkness Wide, Seán Hewitt is very much aware that he is telling one side of a story that is incredibly complicated. He's talking particularly towards the end of this book about looking after a man who is in the absolute depths of despair and mental anguish, and how he is trying to support him, but also how he can't really access his brain. He sort of, this partner of his is losing sense of reality, but it's Seán Hewitt's reality that he's losing track of. His own internal monologue is sort of fairly sensible to him, even if it's an incredibly destructive one. And so it really got me thinking about how memoirs and the telling of stories of sort of real stories are always these incredibly complicated things, because, there's the sort of old adage of there are three sides to every story, my side, your side, and what really happened. And I find it really fascinating how memoirs do this. You sometimes get these memoirs where people really tell on themselves. They really go into detail about how they would have been wrong and how they themselves have messed up royally. And those stories are often really painful to read, but really important for various reasons. But memoirs don't often do that. We obviously only really are able to see life through our own eyes, and occasionally glance into the lives of others or the perspectives of others, and sort of hope that it carries across into how we think about our own stories as well. That also got me thinking of a really quite incredible book, I think, In Memory of Memory by Maria Stepanova and translated by Sasha Dugdale. And this was a book that was shortlisted for the International Booker Prize a few years back. And Fitzcarraldo themselves published it as non-fiction. It was one of their white cover books. But the book was shortlisted for a fiction prize, and I think it points to the fact that not only was this book quite a blurred one in terms of genre and where it fits and what kinds of things it covers, but how fiction and non-fiction, particularly when it comes to memory, kind of get blurred. Us telling a narrative story of our lives is non-fiction, but also to some degree we are fictionalizing something. We're adding a narrative and a flow and a shape to a story that may or may not be true to some degree, or may be our version of the truth. And I think In Memory of Memory also does some really interesting things with the author often looking back over photos and sort of documents from her family from that time. And all the time that she's doing so, she is trying to piece together a history that may or may not have existed. And in that sense, she starts telling a fictionalized story. It's almost auto-fiction, but of people who aren't writing it. So it's sort of this fiction and non-fiction sort of blurred. And I just find it really quite fascinating, because I think the way we often approach memoir is that it has a specific truth to it, that we want memoirs that are raw and honest and unfiltered. But to some degree, memoir and memory always will be filtered or will always be somewhat tempered by our own sense of what that is. We're maybe being incredibly raw about our own history, and we think we are telling the truth to some degree, and we are, in the sense that we understand our own truths, but potentially we are also really writing a new narrative that fits how we saw the whole situation. And obviously all of this is messy. There's never going to be a perfect way of an entirely concrete story that's definitely true or definitely not true or what have you. But I find it really fascinating the ways that memoir can achieve this. And it really, I think all of this has been sort of really amplified by reading Wish I Was Here, which I think really throws into question some of the other things that I found reading some of the books. I sometimes found, for example, in Paris Hilton's memoir, that she felt like she was holding back at certain points. And obviously we don't have to tell everybody everything all the time for that to be fully the truth. But those might be her perspectives on it of, well, I can't understand why this thing happened to me. And the reader might have a different view on it. And so all of this is a very long way of saying, firstly, that I think this book is very, very important and really kind of just brilliant in many ways, just in the way that he resists normal temptations to write, structure, sort of prioritize parts of narrative in a memoir. And instead, this book is almost more about the writing process and about trying to remember, but also trying to not completely tell lies when you're trying to tell the truth. But I think it really throws into kind of relief so many other books like Seán Hewitt's All Down Darkness Wide in a really fascinating way that I hadn't considered. This has been a little bit of a rambly thing, a little bit more off topic than maybe some of the things I've been reading recently. But I just really wanted to share it because it's been something that's bubbling around my brain. I'd also really like to hear if you've got any recommendations of books that you think play with this idea of memory a lot. Memory is a thing that I find fascinating in so many books. Julian Barnes, with the book that I've now forgotten the name of, wonderful irony in this, his Booker-winning book, I think I found just so incredible for the way it played with the sense of a main character who doesn't get it and who doesn't remember things how they actually happened. The Remains of the Day by Ishiguro, I think, also does that really interestingly, where there are things hidden from how we talk about memory. And I'm fascinated by that, partly as somebody who is incredibly forgetful, but also as somebody for whom memory is such an interesting part of how we as humans construct our narratives and our lives and so many other things. Anyway, I've been rambling a little bit. I've been Bob. Please feel free to recommend any books that you think might also fit within this sort of idea. And take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.